On the night of October 31st, 2002, police officers arrived at what looked like one of the safest neighborhoods in São Paulo, Brazil. The house belonged to one of the country's most respected families. Inside, they found two successful parents brutally murdered in their own bedroom. At first, everything pointed toward a violent home invasion. The house had been ransacked, drawers were open, objects were scattered across the floor. The family's daughter appeared devastated. She cried. She hugged her boyfriend. She told investigators she had just discovered the bodies alongside her younger brother. But within days, detectives would begin noticing details that didn't make sense. The crime scene seemed staged, and before long, investigators would uncover a story so disturbing that it would become one of the most infamous murder cases in Brazilian history. This is the story of Suzane von Richthofen, a case that shocked an entire country and continues to divide public opinion more than 2 decades later. Before we continue, if you enjoy well-researched true crime documentaries from around the world, consider subscribing and turning on notifications. There are many stories that never make international headlines, and this channel is dedicated to bringing them to a global audience. To understand why this crime had such an enormous impact, it's important to understand who the victims were. Manfred Albert von Richthofen was a German-born engineer who had built a successful career in Brazil. His wife, Maricia von Richthofen, was a respected psychiatrist. Together, they had created a comfortable life for their 2 children, Suzane and Andreas. The family lived in an upscale neighborhood of São Paulo, in a large home equipped with security cameras and an alarm system. From the outside, they appeared to have everything: financial stability, professional success, a respected family name. Friends and neighbors described them as disciplined, educated, and highly protective of their children. Suzane, born in 1983, grew up surrounded by opportunities. She attended private schools and later enrolled in law school. Many people who knew her described her as intelligent, polite, and soft-spoken. Nothing about her public image suggested she would one day become the central figure in one of Brazil's most notorious criminal cases. But behind closed doors, tensions had been growing. In 1999, Suzane met Daniel Cravinhos. Their relationship quickly became serious. Daniel came from a very different social and economic background. According to investigators and testimony presented during the case, Suzane's parents strongly disapproved of the relationship. The reasons have been debated over the years. Some reports describe concerns about Daniel's influence. Others pointed to differences in lifestyle, financial background, and frequent arguments between the families. Whatever the exact reasons, one fact is undisputed. The relationship became a constant source of conflict inside the Richthofen household. As time passed, those conflicts intensified. According to evidence presented during the investigation and trial, Suzane and Daniel continued seeing each other despite her parents' objections. The situation became increasingly hostile. Arguments became more frequent. Trust inside the family began to disappear. To outsiders, however, none of this was visible. The Richthofens still looked like the perfect family. Their neighbors had no idea that behind the walls of the mansion, relationships were slowly falling apart. Then came October 31st, 2002, a date that would forever change Brazilian criminal history. That evening, Suzane took her younger brother, Andreas, to an internet cafe. ensuring he would be away from the house for several hours. According to prosecutors, this was not a coincidence. It was one of the first steps in a carefully planned sequence of events. What happened next would become the focus of one of Brazil's most closely watched murder investigations. While Andreas remained at the internet cafe, Suzane returned home. According to the prosecution's case, Daniel Cravinhos and his younger brother, Christian Cravinhos, were already preparing to carry out the plan. Investigators later alleged that the brothers entered the Richthofen residence after being allowed inside without signs of forced entry. This detail would become one of the first major clues that the crime was not a random burglary. Inside the house, Manfred and Maricia had already gone to bed. Neither of them knew they were about to become victims of a carefully orchestrated attack. According to the evidence presented during the trial, the couple was assaulted while they slept. Both suffered fatal blows to the head with iron bars. The attack was swift and extremely violent. Medical examiners concluded that neither victim had a realistic opportunity to defend themselves. The brutality of the crime shocked even experienced investigators. But the violence itself wasn't the only thing that raised questions. What happened after the murders would prove just as important. Prosecutors argued that the crime scene had been deliberately altered. Rooms were searched. Drawers were pulled open. Objects were scattered across the house. Some valuables remained untouched. Others were taken. The scene appeared to suggest that burglars had entered the home, killed the couple during a robbery, and fled. At first glance, the theory seemed possible, but experienced homicide detectives began noticing inconsistencies almost immediately. There was no evidence of forced entry. The family's security measures had not been bypassed in the way investigators would normally expect during a home invasion. Several details inside the house seemed strangely selective. Some expensive items had been ignored. Other actions appeared designed more to create the appearance of a robbery than to actually steal valuable property. Meanwhile, Suzane returned with her younger brother. According to her initial statement, they found the house unusually quiet. When they entered, they eventually discovered their parents' bodies. Emergency services and police were called. Neighbors watched in disbelief as officers surrounded one of the city's most respected homes. News spread rapidly. The murders dominated television broadcasts across Brazil. At that point, public sympathy was almost entirely with Suzane and Andreas. People believed they had lost both parents in a senseless act of violence. Few could imagine that investigators were already beginning to question the burglary theory. As detectives reconstructed the timeline, they interviewed family members, friends, neighbors, and anyone connected to the victims. They carefully analyzed phone records, financial information, witness statements, security evidence, and they repeatedly returned to one troubling question. If this had truly been a robbery, why did so many details fail to fit that explanation? Another point caught investigators' attention. Witnesses described Suzane's behavior differently. Some believed she appeared genuinely devastated. Others thought her emotional reactions seemed unusually controlled for someone who had just discovered such a horrific crime. Investigators were careful not to treat behavior alone as evidence. People respond to trauma in very different ways. Instead, detectives focused on objective facts, and those facts slowly began pointing them toward an entirely different theory. Within days, investigators started examining the relationship between Suzane and Daniel Cravinhos more closely. Friends described frequent conflicts between the couple and Suzane's parents. Authorities also learned about the family's strong opposition to the relationship. What initially appeared to be background information soon became central to the investigation. As detectives dug deeper, inconsistencies in the suspects' accounts became increasingly difficult to ignore. Small contradictions began appearing during interviews. Individually, they seemed minor. Together, they painted a very different picture from the one presented on the night of the murders. The investigation was approaching a turning point, and once detectives confronted the suspects with the growing body of evidence, the carefully constructed story would begin to fall apart. As investigators continued analyzing the evidence, the theory of a random burglary became increasingly difficult to defend. Every new piece of information seemed to point in the opposite direction. Detectives reconstructed the timeline minute by minute. They compared witness statements, they reviewed phone records, they analyzed the crime scene repeatedly. The more they investigated, the more convinced they became that the murders had been carefully planned. Attention quickly turned toward Suzane and Daniel. Police conducted additional interviews, looking for inconsistencies. At first, both maintained versions of events that supported the burglary narrative, but investigators noticed contradictions. Small details that didn't match. Certain timelines changed. Some explanations conflicted with physical evidence collected inside the house. Eventually, the pressure began to build. Only a few days after the murders, investigators made a breakthrough. According to official records, Daniel Cravinhos confessed his involvement in the crime during police questioning. His confession dramatically changed the course of the investigation. Soon afterward, Christian Cravinhos also admitted participating. Not long later, Suzane herself confessed to taking part in planning the murders, although the defendants would later present different versions of certain details throughout the legal proceedings. The confessions confirmed what investigators had already begun to suspect. This had not been a robbery. It had been a planned family homicide. Brazil was stunned. News broadcasts interrupted regular programming. Newspapers placed the story on their front pages. Television commentators struggled to explain how a young woman from one of São Paulo's most respected families could become involved in such a crime. Many people found one aspect especially difficult to understand. Unlike many notorious criminal cases driven by financial desperation or organized crime, this family already had wealth, education, and social status. To many Brazilians, the case challenged long-held assumptions that violent crime was mainly associated with poverty or unstable environments. The investigation also revealed evidence that prosecutors argued demonstrated planning before the murders. According to court records, discussions had taken place before the crime. The timing had been carefully selected. Andreas had been intentionally taken away from the house that evening. The victims were attacked after they had gone to sleep. Following the killings, the scene was altered to resemble a robbery. Prosecutors argued these actions showed premeditation rather than an impulsive act. The defense, however, presented a different perspective. Throughout the legal process, attorneys challenged aspects of the prosecution's interpretation. They questioned motivations, disputed certain conclusions, and argued over each defendant's level of responsibility. Those legal arguments would become central during the trial. Another question dominated media coverage. Why? Why would someone participate in the murder of their own parents? Investigators explored several possible motives. The prosecution argued that Suzane wanted freedom from her parents' control over her relationship with Daniel. Financial factors were also discussed during the investigation, although motive remained a subject of legal debate throughout the proceedings. Psychologists, criminologists, journalists, and legal experts all offered different interpretations. Some emphasized emotional manipulation. Others focused on family conflict. Some believed the relationship between Suzane and Daniel had become so intense that ordinary disagreements escalated into something unimaginable. To this day, people continue debating exactly what motivated the crime. What is not disputed is that the investigation uncovered sufficient evidence for prosecutors to formally charge Suzane von Richthofen, Daniel Kreviños, and Christian Kreviños with the murders. The stage was now set for one of the most closely followed criminal trials in Brazilian history. Millions of people would watch as prosecutors, defense attorneys, forensic experts, and witnesses attempted to answer one final question: who was truly responsible? And would justice satisfy a nation searching for answers? Following her conviction, Suzane began serving her sentence in the Brazilian prison system. Like many inmates convicted of serious crimes in Brazil, her legal status changed over time as she became eligible for different stages of the country's prison progression system. Under Brazilian law, some prisoners may gradually move from a closed prison regime to less restrictive conditions after serving part of their sentence and meeting legal requirements established by the courts. These decisions do not erase the conviction. Instead, they are part of Brazil's criminal justice system and are subject to judicial review. Over the years, Suzane became eligible for temporary leaves, educational opportunities, and later less restrictive prison conditions. Each new court decision generated intense public debate. Many people believed she should never receive any form of release because of the nature of the crime. Others argued that the justice system should apply the law equally to every inmate, regardless of how famous the case had become. As the years passed, Suzane largely avoided the public spotlight. Unlike many notorious criminals who seek media attention, she granted very few interviews. Most information about her came through official court decisions and reporting by major Brazilian news organizations. In 2023, after serving more than 2 decades of her sentence and meeting the legal requirements established by Brazilian courts, Suzane was granted release under Brazil's legal system. The decision once again divided public opinion. For some, it represented the normal application of Brazilian law. For others, it reopened painful memories of one of the country's darkest crimes. Meanwhile, Suzane's younger brother, Andreas von Richthofen, chose a very different path. After losing both parents and seeing his sister convicted for participating in their murders, he largely stayed away from public life. Over the years, he has consistently sought privacy, rarely speaking publicly about the tragedy that permanently changed his family. His story serves as a reminder that criminal cases often leave lasting consequences for surviving relatives, many of whom never chose to become part of the public conversation. Even today, More than 20 years after the murders, the Richthofen case continues to be studied by criminologists, psychologists, legal experts, and journalists. People continue asking the same questions. What drives someone to turn against their own family? Could the tragedy have been prevented? Were there warning signs that went unnoticed? There are no simple answers. The case remains one of Brazil's most discussed criminal investigations because it challenged deeply held beliefs about family, trust, privilege, and violence. It demonstrated that appearances can be misleading. From the outside, the Richthofen family seemed to have an ideal life, but behind closed doors, unresolved conflicts, broken relationships, and devastating decisions led to irreversible consequences. More than 2 decades later, the names Manfred and Maricia von Richthofen are still remembered as the victims of a crime that shocked an entire nation, and the name Suzane von Richthofen continues to symbolize one of the most infamous criminal cases in Brazilian history. Rather than offering easy conclusions, this case leaves us with difficult questions about human behavior, responsibility, and the lasting impact that violent crimes have on everyone they touch. If you found this documentary informative and would like to discover more true crime stories from around the world that rarely reach international audiences, consider subscribing to the channel. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.